All right, it's 11:25. I want to keep you guys and honor your time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Aaron Hayes, and this is Kristina Mallon, and we used to teach together at West Chicago Community High School before Kristina moved down to Florida. And this is talking about, well, I'm taking Kristina's thunder, so I'm going to go ahead and move ahead. This is us back in younger days, and me about 50 pounds ago. So we're veterans teachers. We teach a lot of the same stuff. And if you've taught AP statistics or you know your AP statistics teacher, you kind of know that they're often the only teacher who teaches it in your school. And the AP stats community is really tight because a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about teaching stats, at least early on. And so there's a lot of sharing going on. And that's kind of what started as when I took over teaching AP stats from her. When she headed down to Florida, we continued to collaborate on a whole bunch of stuff. So anyway, I will turn it over to you, Kristina.
So I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about how I've been racking my brain on how we even stumbled upon StatsMedic. So it was, I might have first heard about it at one of the AP readings, either in maybe 2016 when they were just kind of starting up with just resources. And then in 2017 is when they had all of the activities up and running.
Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt. This link down here, the bit.ly, if you type that in, that's going to have a copy of the presentation and a list of resources like the websites to go to StatsMedic, the Algebra lessons that was advertised and stuff like that. So, all right, I'm sorry.
So, yeah, basically the whole idea of, and I'm the first one to admit that I'm so old-fashioned a lot of times when it comes to teaching, but the whole experiential learning and which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Should the kids have the skills first before they apply, or should they learn through applications? And that's been something that I've always kind of had trouble wrapping my head around. But a lot of times you start with those activities and the kids are unable to make those connections. And that's where StatsMedic, at least for me, this is going to be like a big commercial for me, it's going to seem, but has kind of transformed my stats classes, especially with the demographic of students that I teach. So their philosophy is basically, again, like Aaron was saying, stats teachers are often islands. We don't necessarily have our immediate support group at our own schools and at our departments. So we rely a lot of times on each other through distance, but basically to support stats teachers, and through doing that to transform stats education by empowering the teachers to lead student-centered classrooms. So the whole idea of being able to teach flexible thinking rather than just having the students do rote memorization. The biggest thing, and I'm going to go, the biggest thing I have found, the most difficult thing I have found was giving up the control. And I'm going to kind of talk through kind of my journey through adopting the StatsMedic philosophy in my AP stats class. And then Aaron will kind of go into how he's been applying it in Algebra 1. So EFFL, experience first, formalize later. Every lesson has 4 components. So while everything is activity-based, it's very structured. So we had originally wanted to lead you guys through a full activity, but they typically run 50 to 60 minutes each. So that wasn't going to happen. So I'll just kind of talk you through a completed one and talk you about the pitfalls of the one that I'm displaying and then where I have since changed things. The structure, you start with the activity, and typically those are 20, 25 minutes. And then you do what's called the debrief. And so the activity the students work, they work in their groups or with their partners. The idea is that the teacher would walk around and do check-ins. And then throughout the activity time, select the groups to put their answers up on the board. They have to have a group consensus. So it's taking the pressure off calling on individual students, especially since they are discovering concepts and theories and working on their own. And I personally, while I want some mistakes, I try to be very selective with who I'm going to have put their work up there. There's certain mistakes that I will allow that I want on the board because it's going to open some tremendous discussions about the content. So kind of pick and choose with that. The debrief is the part that I didn't fully get when I first jumped all in with StatsMedic. So I jumped all in 100% into fall of 18. And I was doing the activities, and it did make a difference. And my kids were gaining a much bigger conceptual understanding of the concepts in AP statistics, but it wasn't as good as it could have been because I was not implementing the lessons as effectively as I should have. And I'll talk about the big aha moment that I had when I went to the workshop last December. So the debrief, then after the kids have put their answers up on the board, basically I had red pens. I went out and got red pens for all the tables in my classroom, and we would go through all of their answers. And that's where we would start formalizing certain vocabulary words or certain notation. And they would use the red pens and kind of mark up their work on the activity. And then you go into the big ideas, and that's just a quick summary of the concepts, the vocab, the formulas. And then there's a check your understanding, which is a quick, short skills. So this is, I'm not the biggest sports person, so this one was a struggle for me, but the kids love this one. This is to introduce binomial distributions. And the kids always have trouble with probability, and this made it very concrete. So this is from 2018. This is my smart board from 2018, where I was not fully, I had not fully given control. What?
I said, sorry, I clicked accidentally.
Oh, you're fine. And this is the piece where I was not stepping back when I should have. So the idea was that the kids would have this and let them struggle through it, give them time to discuss with each other and kind of argue their way through it and work through it while you're checking in with the groups and still providing the support to them individually. I was doing a lot of hand holding. So we did this together on the board, but it made some very good discussion with why are there 3 ways, for example, that the team could have lost after the first shot because if they missed, or with the 3 remaining shots, because they could have missed 2 of the shots in any order type of thing. So getting them to think about the possible ways that the shots could fall. And then as they were filling out number 3, we watched those last 2 minutes of the game. And I would stop it after each shot was made, and they'd have to recalculate the probabilities. And this really drove home the idea of just the binomial distribution and how to calculate a probability and get at the idea of the binomial coefficient at the same time. So you can, sorry.
No, it's okay. Just making sure.
And then we went into the big ideas. So for the sake of time, I did have these pre-typed and the kids could just, here's your vocabulary. What I have written up on the top, the make 2, missed 1, and then the 3 times 0.72 times 0.72 times 0.28, that was just kind of the recap on the structure of how we found those probabilities when we were going through the discussion of where did the formula for the probability come from. So that's something in future years that would be done during the debrief on the previous page. And then,
oops, wrong. There we go.
You're good. And then the check your understandings. These could take 5 minutes. They could take 15 minutes. And depending on your kids, just kind of some tips as far as structuring these. Sometimes we run out of time. Ideally, the kids have time to work on these together, check the answers before they leave the room. You could use it as an exit ticket. You could use it as a class summary. If you run out of time, I've given them as homework assignments in addition to any other practice work they might have. But it's just a direct application of the concepts they've just done. So using the notation, using the vocabulary, things like that.
And as you see on some of this, this is directly below the the big ideas. And so they've got a 1-page summary per lesson where they've got basically some very good theory followed by some examples, which I think is one of the other big things that I have found to be helpful as well.
Yeah, and just the setup and the structure, and it seems it seems so basic when you look at it, but it's amazing how it works for some of the kids. So I teach in rural Central Florida, and at a Title I school. So extremely diverse, a lot of socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And they don't know how to play this game of school. And having everything in one place like this, you see the kids referencing back. You see them going back and looking through notes instead of just stopping and not knowing what to do or saying, I don't get it. They're actually becoming a little bit, it's training them to become more independent learners. And that has been one of the biggest changes.
And the other thing that we found is that towards the end of the year when we're prepping for the AP exam, and I'll explain what happened in my algebra class a little bit more too, the kids are referring back to when they see problems, they're linking it to their experience, not necessarily the content. So it's like, oh, that's like the Skittles lab we did. Oh, that's like with the 3-point shot that they took, or that type of thing. And it was really neat to it's wiring a different part of their brain to help it's giving them one more place where they can make some connections that helps them access the information at a later date too.
So you can probably
jump to the next one? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. So what has happened? So I want to talk a little bit about then the workshop in December. So when we went to the workshop in December of 19, I had pretty much already been all in StatsMedic for a year and a half, not really knowing that I wasn't implementing it as best I could. So that was using the debrief. This lesson came after that activity. So this was actually last February of 2020 that we did this lesson. And this is one of the first ones. It had taken a big shift for the kids because they were used to me holding their hands and still kind of walking through everything with them at the board. And this is one of the first lessons where I really forced myself to completely give up the control on this first page and let them just have at it. And it took a little longer than I would have liked. This is one of those days where the check your understanding was a homework assignment because we barely got through the big ideas on the back. But it's introing the chi-square test for homogeneity. So a little bit of background, they've already done a chi-square test of significance for goodness of fit. But it's silly. We can get into some heavy topics with, is there hiring discrimination with hiring practices and things like that, or we can play with gummy bears. And this was one of the let's play with food days, which have been few and far between this year. But so we had gummy bears and they needed to figure out if the color distribution between Haribo and the Lidl store brand gummy bears was the same. So they had to collect the data. I had a separate chart on the board where we tallied up the class data. Every kid got a bag of 2 bags of gummy bears, essentially. So they counted up a total of 712 gummy bears, but they had to, I just sent groups up to do the full class tally and fill out that table. And once we had that table done, I left them for 2 through 4. And again, you're kind of giving up the control and you can see the handwriting starts getting a little crazy depending on who you send to the board. But they got through 2 through 4 great. Now, if you know your stats, every book for the expected value of a two-way table just says row total times column total divided by table total. And it's memorize that and why. Well, we hadn't discussed that at all. We hadn't talked about how to calculate the expected value of a two-way table. I just left them to try to figure it out. And I sat and watched.
So you're saying this part right here wasn't something that you originally wrote down?
We had never, no, that was done during the debrief.
Okay.
So that would be like what they would have written in as part of their notes for the debrief. That was not there. We hadn't talked about it yet. We hadn't defined anything. They were just given that table and told to come up with the expected value. And it took a while. But eventually they started making the connection that, well, expected value is the proportion of something multiplied by the sample size. And what's in red on the left is yes, thank you. The student the group that finally came up with it, and I let the other groups kind of suffer for a couple more minutes before I let them explain. That's what they had come up with. they had kind of come up with, well, if we have the proportion of the total gummy bears that are Haribo, then the proportion of red gummy bears should have been the same proportion. So they took that proportion of Haribo times the number of red gummy bears, and that's how many red Haribo they would have expected. And there are your numbers from the row total, which was 165, times the column total, which was 313, divided by the table total. And they came up with that formula on their own. And I think that year was my 14th year of teaching AP Stats. And I think it might be the first year that I can confidently say I had students fully internalize that formula and where it came from. And I know it's not a big picture piece of AP Stats, but I thought that was a huge battle to win because that conceptual knowledge that they had built got them to that point. So, but that was the turning point for me, was really stepping back and letting them struggle through it.
And so, yeah, and that, again, it's a better engagement and the students linking to the concept. And Kristina and I were talking ahead of time, and I had joked that when I use this in Algebra 1, I had classroom management is not my biggest strength, okay? And I had far fewer incidents with my classroom management issues when I was using this. And she said, well, even in stats, it's the same idea because you have fewer kids just kind of zoning out. It's less lecture. Your kids are active. And this internalization has been really, really helpful. And so jumping off from Kristina's talking about the workshop, we were about to get ready to do systems right afterwards in my Algebra 1 class. And so I'm like, all right, I think I can do this. We can go all in, short activity, bring it all together, debrief it, and go. And so I decided, and I pushed myself to make sure that every time we were doing new lessons in this systems unit, I was going to do something, this experience first, formalize later. When I first got to West Chicago, we were using the Key Curriculum's algebra books for that. And for that, if you've used those before, the activities are really pretty good, except that they tend to go way too long. And the training, at least that I got, was if you have the kids do the activity, you can send them home and they'll be able to do their homework, which was not the case. And that was my big thing with this, is that a lot of times the projects, you would have to debrief the next day. Some kids would get finished, in 10 minutes. Other kids would take the whole period. And so I really was kind of interested in, can I build something that's something guided, maybe take 20 minutes, and then give the kids a chance to work on it. And so the first step in doing this is that you kind of have to decide, is there a realistic context that you can use? And so for my first one, we had just got done graphing linear lines. And so I decided all of our foreign language clubs have a sister city. And so we had just heard some information. A former student of mine who teaches in the Spanish department was getting ready to take a class over to Spain. And I said, hey, there we go. So I'm going to use that. And so I said, all right, you're saving $10 a week. And you and your best friend are going to turn in your down payments. You have 100, they have 50. You're going to turn it in when you guys have the same amount of money. And so I have them go through and just graph. And this is something where if the kids I'm not having them putting it in a linear equation. I'm just having them graph it up over here across the graph. So that way, again, it's accessible, and it's just one of the things which I like about StatsMedic's philosophy is that while kids can kind of use regular math, a lot of it's also designed that they can just kind of do the math in a way that most people do math, and they don't write equations for it. They just say, okay, I have $100 and then I have 110 and 120. Okay, so that's one way that you can do it. I got stumbled a little bit, but then I remember StatsMedic doesn't always put a context to it. If you don't have a context to it, you build it upon previous knowledge. And so when we were getting into the solving by elimination, I was a little stuck in terms of how can I bring the elimination part into a context. And so I just went back, and I had spent a lot of time first semester talking about how when you're solving equations, you need to have equal things on both sides to make it legal to do. And so I built off of that. And so then I had them down over here. So I kind of drew this out, had them draw this out here first. And then down here, it was just a matter of saying, all right, so how can we write 7 a whole bunch of times, and have them do it in different forms and see that they still kind of came up with the same answer. So again, you're building some of that concepts, but it's still a very doable thing for the students. Now, in my algebra class, Kristina did a good job in terms of saying with stats, you can kind of just let them go, because obviously kids who are upper high school, AP kids are a little bit more self-directed than most. With my algebra kids, I had to do a little bit more, and my co-teacher, we kind of had to do a little bit more of the direct teaching, or at least talking through it. And we did a lot of walking around and a lot of kind of pushing and nudging on this. But again, I was also doing this in the middle, or just at the beginning of second semester. So I had already kind of established my classroom culture at that point. And so it took a little bit, I think starting from the beginning of the year, it would be a little bit easier to do. Now, the second thing that you need to do is that after you kind of decide which way you want to go, you need to build out the steps that can be done with some support. And the support can either be from the group. And again, the groups are about like 3 to 4. Sometimes I put the kids in groups randomly. Sometimes I, do the whole, make sure that you've got a good cross-section of your class in there. But now notice here, this is something that, again, most freshmen, even if you're not totally confident about graphing lines, can probably go through and do. So here I had them graph their money starting at 100, going up each one, graphing starting at 20, or where is it? They're starting at 50 and continue up from there. And then I have them take both of those graphs and just put them on the same graph. Because again, I don't want to have them intimidated about trying to put them both on the same graph. But then all of a sudden, and then you just ask a question, what do you notice? And then what would that mean? And again, it starts these discussions about what's going on. And the cool part that I found with some of these lessons is that since they're discussing going to Spain, it did 2 things. First of all, they're not focusing on the math. They're like, ooh, have you ever been to Spain? And they're starting to have these little conversations while they're working on their math and on the graphs. And the other thing which I found, which I hadn't even planned, a lot of my freshmen didn't know our school had foreign trips. And so it kind of opened up some of those discussions, and it kind of opened, them up to some possibilities as things that they could do at our high school. But again, they're doing math without doing math. I had one student last year who about 30 minutes into one of the things is like, wait a second, we've been doing math for 30 minutes. I thought we were just having fun, which was kind of neat. So again, manageable steps that they can go through and do. And again, you're shooting for maybe about 20, 25 minutes on this. And it doesn't have to be a complete thought. You're just opening them up to kind of see the concept. And then you can start pointing out some things, but before, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot I had this one. This would be the one which is the elimination one. So a little bit later on, I'm just saying, all right, so since we have equal things, I have them point out of trying to say here, okay, 10 is equal to this 2x plus 3. I have them say up here, okay, these things are equal. So since they're equal, I'm just like, add them up together, see what happens. And so they obviously very quickly see the x's disappear, and then they start to take the next step themselves, which is really kind of neat to see. And again, in a group of 4, and at this point the kids knew each other fairly well, they could kind of just start playing around with it a little bit. And this lesson is probably like 5 or 6 deep from some of the other ones. In between, this was actually taking a break because I think we had taken 4 days about talking about how to get to Spain and raise money on how to do that. So they were kind of like, oh, wow, at least we don't have to talk about a Spanish trip today. But again, it's something simple, it's something easy, and it's very doable, and something that you can stop by as a teacher and not have to give a major explanation about, and you can just kind of give them a push. And if they get it wrong, there's other people around to support them from there. This is probably the part, I used to do something called, which Kristina had also showed me, there were these statistics learning cards, which were kind of like a little bit bigger than index cards. You tape them into folders, and it would be kind of like a go-to one-place-fits-all place where you can find information. And I was doing that in algebra. And this kind of takes the place of that. But this is probably the biggest, most important part that I found in terms of designing the lessons, is what are you going to put in the important ideas? Some of it you need to tie back to the lesson. But some of it is also trying to make sure it's in a verbiage that the kids can be able to pull up and handle. So again, you need to make sure it connects to the lesson. So like up here on the top one, the solving by graphing, I had to just define what a system of equations were, because that's going to be vocabulary that they're going to hear for this entire 3-week unit. So again, and again, I pointed out it's not just the same problem, it could also be the same situation. And then again, that idea of a solution is the place where they both happens to be works on both lines. And then in terms of the process, it's just basically what we did. And I had them actually go through and work through this. And I said, okay, so we had this, you guys are trying to raise money. What did you do? It's like, well, we graphed the first line, and then we graphed the second line, and then we looked to see where we overlapped. I said, that's exactly it. And the ownership that they get from that, and it sounds, and again, I'm, I like my really hardcore math, and I like just going through it and just seeing the beauty of it. But I also have to remember that most of my students are not like that. But the fact that they could just kind of go through some stuff and come up with the lesson kind of on their own, granted we're holding their hand through it or we're kind of guiding them through it, really also helped a lot. And now they have a one place that we can just look to and go to. So later on when we're reviewing for the quiz on this, they're like, oh, how do I do this? I'm like, why don't you go back to systems of equations day one? And they're like, oh yeah. And they start going through their binder or going through their packet, and they find it and then they go. And so it really, after a couple of days, makes them a little bit more self-sufficient than I've seen my freshmen in a number of years. Down on the bottom for solving systems of equations, and Kristina, what we usually have maybe at most 3 in some of the stats stuff in terms of important ideas. So we're trying to keep these things still 1 or 2. But again, it's like treat both sides as both equations being the same. So again, they're equal values. So you're driving that point home. And then again, and this is the part my kids always do, is that you try to make sure you do X to X, Y to Y, numbers to numbers. Just keep it simple, something that's doable, but something that they can build off of that. And then after that, this will give you something that you can tie back to pointing through back here. See, yes, when we did this, the X's disappeared or the Y's disappeared, or we looked for the intersection where you and your friend were able to then move on and go to Spain. And again, you're tying it to something very concrete, which again ties it back to, I had kids on the test ask me questions about the graphing part, because that's usually the part that we don't do the most of right before they take the test. And they're like, oh, wait, this is back when we were trying to do the down payment, right? I'm like, yeah. And so it was really kind of neat to see them connecting it to something tangible. And then the last part, and this is probably the easiest part, you're going to try to just come up with something simple, 2 different situations maybe of checking for your understanding, where they can practice it there. And again, in algebra, we usually had time for this. Sometimes, as Kristina said, you just like, okay, finish these 2 for homework. You can use them as exit slips. There's a whole bunch of use here, but again, it's giving them some examples to go along with the theory that we're seeing here. So then that way, when they double check it here, they can look back down here and like, oh yeah, that's what I mean. And again, as Kristina said earlier, it seems like stuff that we already know what to do. It's just a matter of putting it in a way and giving it a little bit of context that really, and this is like a total of 2 pages. If you already started digging around on the link out to the algebra lessons, or if you've gone over to StatsMedic or CalcMedic, these are usually, it's rare that some of these things will go 3 or 4 pages. And if you want to see some of these things, I've got a link to my YouTube site because I'm putting all the stats stuff online for my kids this year. There's not a lot to it. It's just kind of some very basic ideas and really hammering it home. In my algebra classes, as I said, the engagement was so much better. My co-teacher, last year I had 2 facilitated classes out of my 3 algebras, and she's like, they're so into it. It's so great. And not that we ever had like lots of problems, but the kids were focusing on the math as opposed to focusing on their phones or trying to take a nap or doing other work or talk with each other. And that alone for me is enough to make sure that I'm going to continue to try to do this next year, or probably 4th quarter, as we're heading back to an AB schedule at my school. Again, as I said, more students referring back to the notes. And in algebra, a lot of it is just training kids how to be students, which has been very, very helpful. And then for me, at least comparing, the scores were about the same as last year. I would probably say in comparison to my colleagues who were kind of teaching under this more traditional route, I found that my test score averages were not quite as far behind of theirs as they would normally be, just because, again, as I said, I had the facilitated classes, so I have some kids a large portion of the classes have IEPs and they struggle with math. So, again, as I said, if the kids can do the same or better, and I can have more engagement, that alone is a win for me as well.
And even,
So,
I was going to say the same can be said for the AP stats. I wish I had taken a picture last February. It was after the chi-square unit. So that was the first unit that I was really, really all in, doing everything properly with the debriefing and everything. And at the end of the unit, I paired the kids off, gave them poster paper, and gave them a random retired AP question that was chi-square of some kind. They didn't know if it was goodness of fit, independence, or homogeneity, and gave them markers, and they had to do the full 4-step process for either a significance test or a confidence interval significance test for chi-squared, or just answer the questions if it was an analysis one. And these boys who had been sleeping half the year didn't pass first semester. I mean, they were leading their partners. They were standing up excited when they were figuring out the problems. I mean, I had never, again, 14 years of teaching AP stats, really seen that level of engagement, trying to do a frappy. And it was really fun. But I do want to clarify one thing. When I was saying like giving up control and sitting back, you're not sitting back.
oh yeah.
You are, constant movement. I mean, I never sat anyways, but it's even more so now, just checking in with each pair, checking in with each group. And it allows you to really get around and, more so than normal, be able to pick up on the individual kids' weak areas, where they might need extra help, where they're going to need, where their strengths are, and just to be able to see that a lot more clearly and a lot more often. So it's been a learning experience.
Yeah. And, obviously with the StatsMedic curriculum, or if the CalcMedic, if you're a calculus teacher, they have everything for AB. And I think, what did you say, Kristina? They're about halfway through pre-calc?
It looks like they're about halfway through.
So a lot of that is taking somebody else's lesson and modifying stuff. If I've linked all the modified lessons that I have done, because instead of having it be, they refer to themselves in their units, so I change it to like our high school and me and stuff like that. And occasionally we'll change a couple of the contexts. But so the prep work isn't quite so much there. In building the algebra, what I found is the question always is like, well, isn't this more work because you're doing more work to try to get this all set up, et cetera, et cetera? Isn't it just easier to throw questions down up on the board? And I guess my response there is this: you gain the time later, because while you're putting maybe more time into building the lesson, you've got more engagement. You don't have to try to reteach as much, because again, the kids are kind of at least a little bit more into it. You're more, as Kristina said, it allows you more one-on-one time with the kids, or in small groups, so you can spend more time with the student who might have a hard time problem solving, or somebody who gets the XY coordinates mixed up and that type of thing. And it does give you better feedback in terms of where your class is, in terms of some of the skills that are building out from that. So as I said, I find that it picks, I pick up the time on the back end from that. So you just have to get used to that.
And I think that even in the future, needing to review before exams or before finals, you don't need as much time, because the conceptual knowledge has such a strong foundation.
Yeah, and that's if you go through the StatsMedic stuff. I mean, it's just like lesson, quiz, lesson, quiz, lesson, review, test. There's not a lot of review time built in because they pick it up. Now, the other thing is, if you're looking, and I said this in my algebra lessons, I think that's all we have here. Yeah. In my algebra lessons, the question, we don't do just all those lessons go straight through. So like after we get through the 2 graphing lessons that I have, we spend a day or two reviewing and just working on problems. And the same thing after we do substitution, the same thing after we do elimination. So it's not like just to do all these and they're set, but it does make those practice days much more engageable, because again, I had probably 10 to 15% more of my kids were more engaged and were ready to do stuff on their own after I did these lessons. I also then had kids who weren't so ready, but then I could spend more time with them. And also then they could have one sheet that they could go back and look at stuff. So, that's been very helpful. So apparently our thought that we didn't have enough time, Kristina, was not as much as we thought we did. So, so if you guys have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat and we'll be more than happy to share. Let's see.
How do you handle student absences, short-term and long-term? I have to be the first one to admit that, okay, we've been back in school since August. In August, we started with a third of our kids virtual, and those kids were outsourced. And then a third of our kids were hybrid and came to school 2 days a week, and the other third of the kids came to school 5 days a week. So we've been back in person. Now I did not do this first semester, and I did lose some kids, and I'll admit that. I am now live streaming every day on Zoom. So I'm the first to admit that this year, a lot of these activities have gone by the wayside because we went back in person in August, but we're told that we can't have the kids working together. We can't be sharing resources, even like pens and paper and markers, and we can't have them working in groups and all of that. So it's been very difficult this year. I still do as many of the activities as I can, and we do a lot more simulation rather than hands-on. But as far as the absences, right now, the expectation is that if they're not in school, for whatever reason, they need to do their best to be on Zoom with me. So at least they're part of the class still.
In terms of like in a standard year and stuff, I would usually have the kids, most of my AP kids would just go ahead and copy the whole activity from a friend. And I say they need to at least get that big idea and the check your understanding pages done. StatsMedic, the thing that we also learned when we went to the pop-up workshop was that they're like, oh yeah, we have all the answer keys online. We tell them to go to statsmedic.com, go to this lesson, just pull up the answer key. And so I've started posting those. This year I have videos where I kind of walk through and I talk through the process of what we're doing. So like for like the gummy bear one, I would say, which I haven't gotten to yet, but I would say, okay, so we take these gummy bears and we split all these things up. And I would kind of talk through some of the thought process, et cetera, there, which doesn't obviously take the same, doesn't give the same experience for it, but it does at least give them a little bit better context. Sometimes I do also have, like in classes and stuff, I'll actually have them run through a Desmos activity that's similar to it and things like that. But if you want to kind of see what I break down the lessons into two different parts. So like the first part's the experience first part. So that's like page 1. And then the main lessons and the examples are on part 2. And so then that way the kids can go back and see it again, hear me talk about them again, instead of just trying to pull it up. Because I know, like, even I remember from college looking through somebody else's notes. I mean, you can copy the whole thing down and have no idea what you're talking about. So I figured at least giving some context there is helpful. The link to the YouTube page is on that resource page, but it's also there too. But again, it's one of those things where, again, with a little intentionality in terms of trying to build some good, decent lessons. A lot of algebra, I always find, like with the story problems, quote unquote, tend to be very formulaic and very like, Mike can paint a room in 3 hours and Johnny can do it in, that type of thing where it's like, I'm never going to do that. So with a little bit of thought, you can probably pull some sort of context they can get buy into. And as I said, I had Mrs. Nelson had sent me an email. Something's like, are you talking about our Spanish trip? I'm like, oh yeah, here, let me send you what I'm doing so you know that what they're talking about. Because I mean, we had one lesson about raising funds to go and do it. We talked about converting money into euros. We had talked about, one other context was, how much money you're going to take for spending money and for meals and all that other stuff. And it was, really kind of cool to see the engagement that the kids had. So just to be safe, I will put the resource list back up there. And as I said, I'll throw this up online if you want to kind of go back and see it again or share it with a friend. Where to go? There we go.
Erin, what were you going to say about?
Oh, I was just saying that I started using the StatsMedic stuff, but I just started it when we were remote. So I'm anxious to try it like when we go back in person, because I'm sure it works a lot better when they can really collaborate. I mean, they're collaborating in breakout rooms, but you can't do exactly the same as what you do in person. So I'm hoping that we go back soon and they can collaborate and get close to each other.
Now, word of caution, they can get very close. The Skittles one was my favorite. They were supposed to do blindfolded Skittles taste testing, and I turned around and the one kid was feeding the other kid like a baby bird and then screaming when he licked his finger. So
oh please, I thought when you were going to say baby bird, like he had chewed them up and put them, okay.
No, but like, hand feeding them. So things you don't think to warn them about, like you do not need to physically feed each other. You can hand them. Yes, best and brightest of the senior class that year. Is cute though.
Yeah. They really are much more engaged, and I don't teach AP Stats. I just teach like the regular honors level classes, but they are much more engaged with these lessons than any of my other lessons ever. I have had some students say that they don't like that, like their notes are like on all these different pages then. So do you like have a notebook where you kind of debrief and take the notes, or do you do it like on the back of their?
So I use the documents as basically as is with slight editing, but I do group them for a unit. So I follow the Practice of Statistics book. So I will go by chapter, and it will be the activity, big ideas page, and then like a summary for the section. And then the next section's there, and I give them a packet every chapter.
Okay.
And you can see a copy of those. I have the packets. Kristina and I use basically the same packets, and we share them. And I've got links to those out on the website too. Or if just email me and I can send you links to them directly if you want to see them. I'll be more than happy to do that. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Erin. Thank you. I just wanted to say that's so generous of you to share the algebra stuff. And I really like the Calc Medic. So
cool. Well,
I do use it, but I'm like you were saying, Kristina, I'm not all in. I mean, and I've only used it this year with the online and hybrid and stuff. So it's not the same, but yeah, I understand how it is a good philosophy, I think, overall.
Yeah, I guess I in terms of the sharing stuff, Luke and Lindsey and the other teachers at their high school in Grand Rapids, are obviously they're just giving all of this stuff out, which I think is amazing. And so I just kind of wanted to make sure that happens, because it's, I do peruse Teacher Pay Teachers from now and then just to see if I see any of this stuff up there. But outside of that, it's just, there's so much stuff going on. And it's just, good stuff is hard to find. And as I watch some of our younger teachers just, when they're planning lessons, they search Google for 30 minutes. I'm like, dude, you could probably build something better faster than that. But yeah, so at least if this can give you guys a start, that would be, it'd be kind of fun to build Algebra Medic or whatever. So
yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Okay, good to see you.
Yep, you too. Bye.